Hello, everyone. Today's lecture is on labor and the American Civil War. If you've been following along with the other two lectures that have started off this semester, this is going to be the last of three that kind of predates the normative labor history 1877 start date, at least that we see in American labor history, right? And so this lecture is going to be covering the Civil War, the end of the chattel slave labor system, and kind of alternate frameworks that were being constructed leading up to and following the Civil War. We're going to talk a little bit about Reconstruction and historiographic debates surrounding emancipation and Reconstruction. We're going to kind of bring everything to that 1877 point. So in our next lecture, we'll be able to start things off there. Before we get started, though, like normal, I like to start off with a couple of book recommendations. For our first class, we had one. Last class, we had two. In this class, we're also going to have two. There's not always going to be two book recommendations, but because of the sizable nature of the topic we're talking about today, I felt compelled to offer two. The first is a little more immediately relevant to our discussion today, the lecture content. It's Stephen Hahn's A Nation Under Our Feet, Black Political Struggles in the Rural South from Slavery to the Great Migration. It basically, Stephen Hahn does a really good job of detailing kind of the history from below aspect of studying slavery and Reconstruction and the Civil War and all of the struggles that the Black Americans kind of have to go through throughout all of these decades. It's one of the greater pieces of history that I would recommend everyone reading if they get a chance. It is a little long, but there's a lot of really amazing stories in there. There's a lot of great information in there if you're into this topic. More recently, actually coming out last year, was Joe William Trotter's Workers on Arrival, Black Labor and the Making of America. Very similar to Stephen Hahn, Joe Trotter tries to look more holistically at the experiences of Black workers in the US in history and kind of contest a couple of pervasive narratives that tend to articulate Black workers and Black people as more of consumers and users in the national economy, like these kind of racist depictions of Black people as liabilities or dependents. Joe Trotter really uses a lot of historical evidence and a lot of research and powerful narrative to kind of dispute those stereotypes and say, actually, you know, when you look at American industrialization, the growth of the American economy, a lot of it is built off of the back of Black labor and is still today. So these are two very, very good historical contributions to the field. Joe Trotter kind of looks more from the founding of the US up until the modern day. Even Stephen Hahn is a little more localized in his focus on Reconstruction up to the Great Migration. So it depends on what you're interested in more specifically, if you wanted to read any of those. But I want to start off our discussion today by addressing a pretty seminal question in history, and that is, at least in American history, right? People who study German history don't focus on this so much, but American historians are constantly debating this question of, was the Civil War about slavery? And I don't want to mischaracterize this discussion. It's not that a whole bunch of credible historians are on one side and a whole bunch of credible historians are on the other side. But it's more along the lines of, there is a popular narrative in parts of the country that depict the Civil War in one way. This is very much like the outcome of social organizations and kind of like aristocratic clubs trying to reframe history to be more cogent and digestible, and the majority of historians really kind of contesting that and saying, no, we need to look at history more objectively and truthfully and say what it is. But let's get into this, right? So was this Civil War about slavery? A lot of times we'll hear arguments coming from people that the Civil War, contrary to being about the issue of slavery, right? It wasn't actually about slavery, but it was about states' rights. The Confederate States seceded from the Union because they were concerned that the federal government was going to increasingly like reach into their ability to govern themselves, and that in order to protect the individual rights of different states so that they wouldn't kind of be forced into doing things the way the federal government wanted them to do, that is why they seceded from the Union. And of course, it's important to ask, you know, if you're talking about states' rights, it's a states' right to what? What rights were the states worried that the federal government was going to be infringing upon? Now, most commonly, you would look at this debate and say, oh, well, you know, it's the state's right to slavery, so ergo, the Civil War is about slavery. A lot of the time, though, people who argue the states' rights kind of lost cause narrative of the Civil War will point to, you know, taxation, the federal government passing laws that were unconstitutional and whether a state had the right to nullify them. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But I think it's important first to start off by examining what specifically the Confederate government said themselves when they were seceding. And they provided explanations for all of this in things called the Declarations of the Immediate Causes which Induce and Justify the Secession of Confederate States from the Union. It's a very long, drawn out title, and it's also not the title, right? Each individual state had their own immediate causes to justify the secession of, and then it would be like, you know, South Carolina from the Union. But they all, upon secession, pretty much put out a similar statement. And we should look in at reading those, right? They're literally telling us why they're seceding here. So South Carolina was the first to go, you may or may not know. Also started the Civil War by firing on a federal fort, Fort Sumter. South Carolina, when it seceded by a legislative vote, mind you, this wasn't like put up to a popular referendum. The people in charge of South Carolina's state government just had a legislative vote to secede. But South Carolina says a geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all the states north of that line have united in the election of a man to a high office of the President of the United States whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. Right? They're saying slavery specifically here. We, therefore, the people of South Carolina, the legislature, have solemnly declared that the union heretofore existing between this state and the other states of North America is dissolved. So South Carolina is leaving because there is a president who is hostile to slavery, and all of these northern states have kind of united to put him in office to end slavery. This, of course, is false. There were like 4 different political parties in the 1860 presidential election. A lot of the northern ones didn't even go for Lincoln, and there were a lot of border states that had slavery that didn't leave the Union. But South Carolina here is saying it is about slavery. Mississippi. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product, which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That blow has been long aimed at the institution of slavery. Sometimes they'll refer to the institution, that's what they're referring to, and was at the point of reaching its consummation. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition or dissolution of the Union, right? So Mississippi here is also saying, not only are we seceding over slavery, there was no choice left to us but, you know, abolition or secession, which again, of course, is false, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But Mississippi here is even conflating slavery with civilization, right? If you're going to get rid of slavery, our society, our civilization, our way of living is going to evaporate. So Mississippi is going even a little bit further, right? They're not only saying the Civil War is about slavery, they're saying their entire society is based on slavery. Louisiana. The people of slaveholding states are bound together by the same necessity and determination to preserve African slavery. All right, it's pretty straightforward. Texas. Texas, of course, joined the Union as its own independent country, expelled from Mexico. They say the servitude of the African race as existing in these states is mutually beneficial to the bond, both bond and free. The destruction of existing relations between our two races, as advocated by our sectional enemies, that's the North, would bring inevitable calamities upon both and desolation upon the 15 slaveholding states. So all of the 11 states that eventually secede from the Union, right? There's 15 slaveholding states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. They remain in the Union. Parts of Virginia obviously remain in the Union as West Virginia, but the rest of these 11, they all come out with similar statements. We're not going to go through all of them. I think I'm kind of getting to the point here that they are all specifically stating upon secession, we are doing this to protect slavery. So, okay. The Civil War was about slavery or states' rights. A states' rights to what? That's where this discussion about taxation and overreach and nullification comes in. How concerned really were the Southern states with federal overreach? Well, in the Declaration of the Immediate Causes, which induce and justify South Carolina, right, that first one from the federal union, they don't only talk about slavery, but they also specifically refer to Supreme Court decisions to uphold states' rights to not use their own response or resources to support the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. So here, South Carolina is actually taking an opposite position of states' rights, right? So in 1793, the federal government passed this provision called the Fugitive Slave Act. This basically said that if a runaway slave had made it to the North, slave catchers could still catch slaves and return them to the South. In a Supreme Court decision in Prigg v. Pennsylvania, was using their state resources to capture a slave. And that was brought into court, right? Does Pennsylvania, or should Pennsylvania be compelled to use their own state resources to capture slaves for the South, even though Pennsylvania is a free state? And the Supreme Court said no, actually. You don't have to do that, you're fine. That really made South Carolina mad. Now, there was another Fugitive Slave Act. This one was passed in 1850, only 10 years before the Civil War started. It basically stripped free states of this right? It was called the Dred Scott decision, also, when it made it to the Supreme Court. And this meant that, like, any slave owner could take slaves with them into northern states, ostensibly. The slaves wouldn't be able to run away and be free, that states had to use their own state resources to support slave catching efforts. So there was a considerable pushback against this kind of federal overreach in the North. But of course, Southern states didn't really mind that. They actively argued for federal overreach against states' rights in order to support the institution of slavery. If this hopefully makes sense. If it doesn't, send me an email. But essentially, not only was the Civil War specifically about slavery, but it was specifically against states' rights, because in preserving slavery, the Southern states wanted to make sure that Northern states did not have these states' right to provide fugitive slaves with any sort of protection or coverage. So was the Civil War about slavery? Yes. All right. Now that we have that settled, we should talk about competing regimes, right? In the Southern United States, there is an agrarian system of chattel slavery. It's very hierarchical. This is obviously not true in the North. And so when people in the South, like when Southern lawmakers, Confederate generals, and individuals supporting the Confederacy, like, come out and say that there's this horrible other system that they're trying to impose on the South, and we need to resist it and defend slavery, or, aristocratic Southern way of life, they are resisting and actively, like, a specifically Northern social system that's different from theirs. So the Southern system combines this kind of extensive social hierarchy with labor-intensive agricultural economics to produce this system that was incredibly rural and decentralized. It was resistant to change, but highly profitable. Wealth was very much stratified, and those who controlled kind of like the largest plantations and the majority of economic resources in the South also held on to political power. So there's very much this kind of landed, entrenched agricultural aristocracy in the South up until the Civil War period. There was, sometimes it's been likened to this kind of feudal system I think that's somewhat accurate. Industrial capitalism still hadn't really come to fruition in the United States by this point. We hadn't really industrialized. So in the South, there is very much this feudal system where you have this very massive planning class, and there are some like smaller yeoman farmers. Um, a lot of uh, a lot of people in the South are either indentured servants, or they're slaves, or they're landless farmers who are working for plantation owners. But the majority of wealth and political power is held by the aristocracy, these plantation owners, and the majority of workers are in some way either indentured or landless, and are therefore working for the people who control all of this land. There is a middle class of yeoman farmers, but they don't constitute uh, the majority of everyone in the South at this time. A yeoman farmer is usually defined as a land holding farmer that did not have slaves. So you might be asking, why would yeoman farmers, right? Why would white farmers who didn't have slaves, both yeoman and landless farmers, why would they support going to war to defend a system like slavery if they themselves don't actually have slaves, right? You can see over here on the right side, there's a pie chart. About 3/4 of whites in the South at the outbreak of the Civil War, more than 3/4 did not have slaves. So why would they fight so hard to preserve a system of slavery? A lot of it actually falls down to hierarchical privileges that are bestowed on white farmers. Even though they don't have slaves, they're given a higher social position in the South just by virtue of their whiteness. So you might remember from earlier class discussions, we talked about the difference between, if someone has Irish or Italian pride versus if someone has white pride. The Irish and Italian pride is actually based on your ethnic and geographic heritage, whereas white pride is something that's specifically articulated as a response and contradiction to blackness. So if you're someone who is demonstrating white pride isn't specifically, proud of their ethnic heritage, they're actually proud that they're not black. Very similar dynamic going on here, right? White farmers, by virtue of not being black, have a better social position, and they want to defend that better social position. A lot of white farmers at the time have this view that if African black slaves are granted freedom, if they're granted emancipation, then suddenly they are going to flood the job market, and white people are going to be basically equal with them, and they don't want that. There were some economic advantages, of course. It wasn't just the matter of being socially viewed as higher, but economically, white farmers were often hired on as overseers for slave plantations. That's, the landless farmer might fall under this, or you might have a yeoman farmer who, in order to supplement their income, has the opportunity to work as an overseer on a slave plantation. This can be economically beneficial for a family, despite how horrific it is. White farmers themselves were also able to kind of carve out niches or specializations in the Southern economy that provided them with a little bit of economic security. A lot of these larger plantations specifically were engaging in what's known as monoculture. That's usually around cash crops. Monoculture, meaning one, and culture coming from agriculture, means you're just growing all of the same thing, just only this crop very intensively. It's environmentally devastating, but also it does not do a lot for your self-sufficiency as a farm. If all of your intensive labor production is going only into cotton or only into tobacco or sugar or rice, depending on where you're at in the South, if all of your labor is going towards a crop that you're basically going to export for money, where's your food coming from, right? Where are all of these different uh, contingent goods that you need to run a farm coming from if all of your focus is going into these cash crops? Well, white farmers were able to grow food and other diverse crops and other materials even, that were needed in the South, that these plantations just weren't taking on. And so by virtue of doing that, by going into these specialized professions as well, yeoman farmers were able to kind of carve out a better standard of living than obviously than any African slaves, but also free blacks who were definitely excluded from those opportunities. We've talked a little bit about the South, right? There is very much this kind of almost feudalistic agrarian system where where political power in society, where economic power in society is very much centralized at the top. In the North, you have a different system. Well, specifically in the North, you have two different systems. You have an ideal system and you have how it's actually panning out. Now, in the North, you have what's called an ideology of free labor. And free labor is inherently opposed not only to slave labor, right, this system of forced labor, it's also opposed to what is known as wage slavery, right? So they're against chattel slavery, but they articulate this difference in the industrial Northeast that they refer to as wage slavery. And we'll talk about that in a second. But on the map over here on the top left, you can kind of see this dividing line that they were discussing in Mississippi's Declaration of Secession. You know, there's a geographic line. You can kind of see the boundaries of this agrarian system if you look at population density and in the North. Now, free labor is a system that's more specifically tied to the Midwest and Western settlers, family-run farms. Remember, we talked about this kind of idyllic agrarian, small family, self-sufficient family farm. This kind of agrarian ideal for the Republic that was in the minds of the founding fathers, ostensibly. That's going to be kind of more toward the Midwest. When you look at areas up here like Massachusetts, Boston, New York, Camden, New Jersey, kind of like this Northeast coast corridor, that is not the system that free labor envisions. That's kind of this industrial system. Now, free labor ideologically argued that a nation was most efficient when all the workers were independent and self-reliant, right? So kind of this family farm, you're not really tied to your landlord, you're not really tied to a representative or a benefactor or someone who you've taken a lot of money from. Workers who have control of their own productive processes have a greater incentive to work harder in exchange for like deferred material rewards. This obviously stands in contrast to a system that was implemented in the South, where work is very much coerced and forced. Personally, I think if I were enslaved, I would not want to work as hard as possible. I'm not benefiting from any of that. I'm not getting any of the rewards if a bumper crop does well versus if it doesn't. That's kind of the ideology at heart of free labor here, is that if we do not have a system of slave labor, everyone is going to work more effectively. They're going to be more efficient because they're going to be working for their own interests, right? They're working basically to their own benefit. People who are only working for themselves are going to work harder. They're not going to, hypothetically, they're not going to be lazy on the job. This is a critique that was made against slave labor as well as wage labor in the industrial Northeast. And people who are self-reliant are going to be able to make for better, more informed citizenry, right? This kind of going back to earlier discussions again, if you have the ability to kind of vote only in your own interests, if you're not voting in the interests of your landlord or someone who's given you rent as kind of a kickback, you're viewed as a more effective part of a representative form of government. This, of course, comes with a lot of biases, right? If you don't have a lot of money, if you don't own land, that means you're not a full citizen. Ideas of suffrage and citizenship being tied to owning land is not a new concept for the United States. This kind of goes back to any kind of experiments in representative government. But this is kind of at the heart of the free labor rhetoric here. This is what the Republican Party at its founding is adopting as its official platform. So it's not like the Republicans at this time are inherently like this party of big business, as some might characterize them as today, but they're very much more like individuals should be working for themselves, right? That is their main argument. Again, kind of getting ahead of myself sometimes in some of these discussion points. The advocates of free labor were opposed both to slave labor in the South and industrial labor in the Northeast. They felt that people who lived in cities, they viewed cities as kind of like this not good thing, not something that was inherently American. And this is because if you lived in a city, you usually had to exchange your labor to someone else in order to make a living. Right? We talked about cottage industries in the last kind of lecture. I almost said episode. This isn't a TV show, but we talked about cottage industries in the last episode, how farms were self-reliant. As the system starts to go away and people start to move into the cities, they're very much their citizenship, their political leanings, their economic activity is increasingly more dependent on their employer, right? There's not a lot of federal or state laws that protect workers' rights or kind of have this barrier between work life and public life. And so the kind of control a workplace and an employer can have on someone's individual life is much more pronounced than it is today. People would argue that today it's more pronounced than it used to be. That's an incredibly fair point to argue, but in contrast to emerging industrialization in the middle and the later 1800s, today doesn't even parallel. Employers had an excessive amount of oversight over the activities of their employees, and free labor advocates said that limited the effectiveness of someone to really participate in a democratic system, right? Because they weren't really just taking their own considerations into account, but those of their superiors, for lack of a better term. So there was chattel slavery in the South, and sometimes free labor advocates in this Republican Party who would look at the industrial Northeast would characterize labor in the Northeast as wage slavery, right? Wage slavery is this concept that says, well, you are free to leave your job and go elsewhere and not work for an employer anymore. That freedom is very much kind of in name only. If you aren't employed, if you aren't working for a job, where is your food coming from? Where is your housing coming from? Basically, the idea behind wage slavery is that you are always required to work for wages because you can't realistically be economically self-sufficient in industrial society. So wages are therefore a form of labor coercion, right? They're a form of slavery. This, of course, doesn't take into the subtle nuances between chattel slavery and wage slavery. For example, if I work at Kroger can't take my child and sell it for profit, right? If I have a child, if someone I know gives birth to a child, their employer doesn't have rights to that child isn't a dependent on their employer. So there's very clearly a substantial difference between working for wages and the chattel slavery system. But in ideological terms, the kind of free labor advocates both viewed both systems as not in line with their preference for the American Republic. So this preference for these small self-reliant farms, this agrarian republic that Jefferson articulates during the American Revolution, kind of remained the hallmark. Now we should talk about the backbone of American industrialization, right? How does America industrialize? For a lot of its early history, America is not a global economic power. Sometimes people who are unfamiliar with American history kind of they forget that part of it, that America wasn't always like a leading power in the world for a very long time. It was considered more of a backwater by Europe, which had industrialized earlier and had kind of led the way in pioneering changes in artwork, literature, modernistic expression that comes at the start of the 1900s. Even Europe is very much seen for a very long time in America's history as the center of the world. The U.S. is not the global hegemon that it is today, and this means that there isn't always assurances that America is going to industrialize. Europe's relationship with the majority of the world is specifically to crush the upsurge of industrialization in other parts of the world. because when other countries start to industrialize, that means Europe has to compete with those industrial powers for control of the world economy. Everyone in the world can produce cash crops, right? You can grow bananas in a lot of different places. You can grow tobacco, you can grow cotton in a lot of different places. But what makes Europe unique at this point in time is that it has all of the coal and the industrial capacity needed to take those raw products and turn them into manufactured goods that it can then export to the rest of the world. Now, in a lot of colonial arrangements, for example, where Europe has more power over the global south that it is either colonizing or kind of manipulating in trade, the system is that these countries would send Europe their raw exports and they would buy back their manufactured goods. And the rate at which you can buy back manufactured goods is less than the amount that you can sell raw materials, because Europe has a monopoly on that manufacturing system, right? So if a country mines a bunch of iron and sends all of that iron to Europe, it might be able to buy like a couple of things that iron is used to create. But because that individual country doesn't have the ability to take that iron and turn it into like a locomotive, right, or turn it into railways by itself, because of that, these countries in the global south don't industrialize. It's very much in Europe's interests not to let the United States industrialize, right? If the United States industrializes, it creates greater competition for Europe in the global economy. That means the US can also sell manufactured goods in the global economy. It can even undercut Europe if it wants to, and so Europe isn't making as much profit as it could. So how does the US then industrialize? If it isn't a global power when it wins independence, and if it's very much not even like a military power necessarily upon independence, how does the US industrialize? Well, we talked a little bit earlier about how the textile industry specifically was one of the first industries to emerge in the United States. And this isn't just like a throw of the dice or a spin the wheel and we landed on textiles and that's what we went with. The US slave labor system in the South, right, and in the states that would become the Confederacy, but also these 4 border states, a lot of the agricultural labor, a lot of the cash crops that are being raised and they're being cultivated by slave labor specifically revolve around the textile industries. Cotton is a really good example, right? In the South, prior to the Civil War, cotton dominated the Southern economy. And by extension, it also kind of dominated the Northern economy as well. Now, the South is very agrarian, it's very rural, it doesn't have a lot of coal or a lot of like large built up cities with a landless workforce that it can really depend on to go into factories or workshops, but the North does. And so in the South, as well as in the North, businessmen and landed farmers realize that they can keep a greater portion of their profits if they send their crop to the North, to these industrial centers to be spun into things like fabrics, clothing, any other sort of goods that are related to the textile industry. Southern farmers, plantation owners get a better share of those profits. And in the North, that labor, that production is performed in-house. So there's not, essentially you have the option for industrialization there instead of sending it right to Europe. And that makes America incredibly rich, right? The US is able to not only send extra cotton to Europe, specifically to Britain. Britain imports a lot of American cotton, but America's own textile industry just becomes huge. And this really speeds up America's process of industrialization and makes it market competitive with Europe. So a lot of times you'll hear historians, and if you don't understand the context, now you do, but when some historians will come out and say that American wealth was built on slave labor, they're specifically referencing the fact that industrialization was only made possible by a massive system of agricultural plantations that created the cash crops needed to supply a native industrial system in the US, whereas it hadn't existed in other countries. So if we were to look back at that map where there was that very clear dividing line between the kind of more agrarian rural South and the more densely populated North, that area in the Northeast specifically, you wouldn't see New York City grow to the size that it does if there wasn't any sort of industrial production going on there, right? The textile factories, the mills that we discussed in our last class that kind of produce these textile goods, as well as New York being this major port of trade, slave labor definitely makes that growth popular. And so it wasn't just, it's worth keeping in mind that it wasn't just the South that benefited from slavery, but the North indirectly, but also directly in its own way benefit from slavery too, right? They're able to industrialize, they're able to trade with the rest of the world. All of that trade generates economic growth, and you have the rise of these massive urban centers like New York, Boston, Lowell, Massachusetts, but then also if you go further west, even in places like Chicago, those more Midwestern cities were also tied to systems of national trade that were dependent on slave labor in the South. I want to go ahead and tackle a different historical mischaracterization that occurs sometimes. The first of the lecture being that the Civil War was about states' rights. It was a states' right to slavery specifically, but also sometimes in telling American history, the effort to end the Confederacy, to maintain the Union and end secession, right, to kind of rein the South back in. The argument will kind of swing too far in the other way on this pendulum, right? Where people will argue that the North fought the war, the Civil War, to end the system of slavery. And that is also kind of not exactly true. Now, while the Civil War was initiated by Southern slaveholding states as a means to protect slavery, Lincoln, as a war president, but also the majority of the North in general, their main objective was not to end slavery, it was the preservation of the Union, right? If your objective is to eliminate slavery, then in 1861, the moment Lincoln becomes president, you would ostensibly have him giving an Emancipation Proclamation then, right? All of these different states are leaving to maintain slavery, so we're just going to do away with slavery, right? If this is a war they want, this is a war we're going to fight. He doesn't do that, though. Lincoln waits until 1863, very well into the war, to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And the 13th Amendment that ends the system of slavery, with some exceptions, doesn't actually come into being until after the war is practically over. Lincoln actively voiced a lot of concerns about making any sort of gestures towards emancipation for a couple of reasons. One, he was afraid of losing these 4 border states that permitted slavery but remained with the Union. Lincoln was worried that if we give slaves freedom, what's to say Maryland and Delaware and Kentucky and Missouri won't also leave and join the Confederacy. So we don't want to make any of those kinds of gestures because, that will worsen our situation. Additionally, it's worth pointing out that Lincoln, while a Republican, was not among the most radical Republicans. Lincoln did not like the system of slavery, but he voiced a couple of times the desire to meet a kind of compromise, right? He very much wanted to offer like a compromise to the South to entice states to rejoin the Union. They ultimately don't go that route, though. But Lincoln very much was more of a moderate Republican in that he viewed slavery as something that needed to eventually be done away with, whether or not it was practical to do now. So then, why does slavery end? If Lincoln doesn't really advocate for it too heavily, and the South is leaving over it, one would expect the North to basically win a couple of military victories, offer the South a compromise on slavery, and the Civil War is over, right? The Union can keep going. Well, as it turns out, the Emancipation Proclamation was the after effect of slaves' massive self-emancipation. Now, as Union troops start moving into different Confederate states, slaves just begin abandoning their plantations and farms, right? Any other sorts of workshops, if they're working in any skilled trades, or if they're working in domestic work, whatever these job sites are, once slaves start to figure out that Union troops are coming, they start to leave. This is basically because the way it is articulated in a war, the North is not returning slaves that are coming to them. This is something that was a practice in the American Revolutionary War, as well as the War of 1812. When British troops arrived in the South, slaves would usually go toward the British lines because it wasn't contingent on the British to, capture the slaves and hand them back over to their enemies. So in warfare, when the North starts to invade the South, a very similar practice. The North isn't going to turn around and send slaves back to the South. They're actively fighting with each other. So slaves start to leave en masse for Union lines. And when they arrive, the responses are a little different, right? Some generals will tell slaves, okay, you're free. You can go ahead and keep going north. Other generals will even offer fleeing African Black slaves. They'll say, hey, if you want to join us, we can create a regiment for you and we can train you to fight against the South. That was something that Lincoln actually opposed for a very long time. The very first regiment of all Black troops that was created, he had disbanded because he was afraid that would prompt the other 4 border states to leave. Some generals justify specifically having slaves work for the army by saying, well, if the South views people as property, it's an act of war, we're requisitioning property. And so now these slaves are working for the army and we're paying them because we want to, but we're not disputing their enslaved status. Lincoln was very much more of a fan of that kind of approach to handling these mass walk-offs. But what these walk-offs by slaves do is they restrict the ability of the Confederacy to fight the war. And that's done because, well, first, if your entire economy is based off of slave labor and slaves start to leave en masse, your economy is not going to fare that well. So the Confederate economy starts to crumble pretty much as soon as slaves start to leave the South. And that turns slavery into a strategic kind of resource for the North, right? Once slaves start to walk away from their workplaces, from their farms, from overseers and masters en masse, the North is forced to recognize the fact that, like, hey, there is a strategic component to ending slavery, or at the very least kind of enticing slaves to leave where they're being kept. Because the Confederacy is fighting the North in a civil war actively, there's less of a slave catching apparatus than there would have been in times of peace. And so what initially starts off as kind of a trickle of people escaping very much turns into a torrent, and the Southern economy essentially implodes. You can see this a little bit on the top left image there. That is the rate of inflation in the Confederacy as time goes on in the Civil War. There are certain spikes in this rise in inflation that you can tie to different events in the war, actually. That first large increase there was the Siege of Atlanta. But essentially, as time goes on, as the productive ability of the Confederacy starts to dwindle, 1, because slaves are leaving farms, 2, because they're all of their ports are blockaded by Northern ships, and 3, just because when you're not growing anything, you can't really trade with Europeans, in addition to not being able to trade with the United States. That all means that they're exporting less, that the dollars they have in circulation have less purchasing power, and so their inflation goes up. So this is inflation can be a very good metric for determining how stable a national economy is. And very clearly, slaves walking off the job, kind of like this mass emigration, just destroys the Southern economy here. So we have this common U.S. historical narrative that the Civil War is fought by the North. We have this election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, and the South says, you're going to take away our slaves, we're leaving. But some people will say it's about states' rights, but really it's not. And then the North says, well, if you're going to leave, we're going to fight you on slavery, and we're going to end slavery in this country. And that's not exactly how it was going. slaves themselves began to self-emancipate in the midst of war. And based on the fact that withholding their labor by leaving was having very real consequences for the outcome of the war, this eventually prompted the North, then in 1863, to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So a lot of times when historians say that the US freed the slaves, right, Lincoln freed the slaves, this isn't exactly true. In fact, it's a point of contention among historians that slaves actively freed themselves and that this made the US government respond. So when we have the 13th Amendment in 1865, this is very much an outcome of the Emancipation Proclamation that was forced by slaves leaving their homes, leaving their work sites, leaving plantations. There were other reforms that kind of come out of the end of the Civil War when the South is eventually defeated. If that wasn't a spoiler, good. But yeah, the Confederacy loses the Civil War. They only exist for about 4.5 years. Most series in Star Trek last longer than the Confederacy. So why it has this kind of like this remaining kind of valorization in the South. It's not because it was a very hard fought war. It's because, they lost. We're kind of getting away from the point though. The 13th Amendment comes out of the Emancipation Proclamation after the end of the Civil War. We also see the 14th and 15th Amendment. These specifically argue that, or they don't argue, they state that freed African slaves are given citizenship. They're now citizens of the United States. For a very long time, the Northern government wasn't really sure how it was going to deal with freed slaves after the Civil War. Lincoln actually said that he wanted to create a colony in Africa and send slaves there after the end of the war. That eventually does happen. It's the country of Liberia was created as an American colony to send slaves to. Not everyone leaves, and eventually Liberia gets its independence as its own self-governing country. The 15th Amendment, at least on paper, provides freed male slaves, right? Not women, but freed male slaves the right to vote. This is, of course, curtailed by a bunch of Jim Crow laws that eventually emerge after Reconstruction. Things like poll taxes, literacy tests, or just, Klan terrorism are basically suppress African Americans' right to vote, even though it's outlined in the 15th Amendment. There were a couple of other reforms that were tied to the Northern invasion of the South. If you don't know who William Tecumseh Sherman is, kind of his march to the sea, it's pretty famous. William Tecumseh Sherman was not, he did not believe in racial equality. He very much believed in white supremacy. But he was also still an abolitionist. And this is kind of an attitude that a lot of people in the Republican Party at the time, Lincoln included, all shared, was that they all promoted a kind of system of segregation, a system of racial exclusion, and even a system of racial hierarchies that placed white people above all people of color. But they just viewed slavery either as morally bankrupt or economically unproductive, or both. So when Tecumseh Sherman starts his march to the sea, kind of going through the South, he starts field orders. This is basically orders that you give out in a zone of military occupation to basically redistribute land amongst African slaves and provide them with use of army mules to help cultivate land. It's sometimes referred to as the 40 acres and a mule promise that the North makes to freed slaves. And this is very much in line with the ideology of free labor, right? That your ability to participate in a representative system is very much tied to your own economic self-sufficiency. And so by giving these tracts of land and use of mules to freed slaves, it was the hope of some of these Republican generals that you would be able to create communities of self-supporting African Americans who would be apart from white communities, and that would contribute to the continuation of this agrarian republic that a lot of these advocates of free labor were in support of, right? This, of course, runs afoul of more moderate forces in the North. A lot of these Civil War land reforms, like the 40 acres and a mule field orders that Sherman issued, they're overturned following the war. And that is because the system of agricultural labor in the South that is very much based under these very massive plantation systems of like monoculture, they're far more profitable than family farms. And so, well, there are different plans that are being put in place increasingly toward the end of the Civil War and then under Reconstruction. You start to see a move away from land distribution, which is viewed as this very radical concept. Even today, when you hear about land redistribution going on in other countries, we have like these notions of this like communist or socialistic plotting and scheming. And it moves away from that and kind of more towards industrial wage labor for African-American workers, but instead of it being industrial wage labor, it's agricultural wage labor. So essentially, a lot of these reforms are overturned for economic benefits, and freed slaves are essentially told, hey, you're going to still work in much the same capacity as you did before the war, but you're going to be given wages instead, and there's still going to be hierarchies, there's still going to be abuses, but that's okay because this is supporting industrialization, right? If you have these smaller family farms, they're not producing the same amount of cotton monoculture that the US textile industry needs to continue growing than if you have these massive plantations under like very centralized leadership. Now, this isn't necessarily just something that the North does alone. This is also an issue that's pushed by Confederates in the South after the war ends. A lot of different organizations are formed to basically challenge any sort of Black economic independence or political participation. The most notable is the KKK, sometimes referred to as the Invisible Army. The Ku Klux Klan was a terrorist organization that was formed by a lot of the officers who had served in the Confederate Army. And they essentially wanted to maintain the system of agricultural feudalism that had existed in the South prior to the Civil War. And so their job was essentially to maintain the status quo that it had existed in as many ways as possible. So, well, even though slavery is gone, by using Klan terror against Black Americans running for public office, right, through by committing assassinations, raids, and other types of political violence and coercion, we can kind of suppress political involvement of African Americans living in the South, and we can also prevent them from building up their own self-controlled systems of capital. If this reminds you of Tulsa, the Tulsa Massacre in the 1920s, that was very much a byproduct of the second Klan that kind of comes to a head at the start of the 1900s. The first Klan there's different clans throughout US history. They have their own kind of traditional traditions and strains of hatred. The first one is very much opposed to any sort of reforms that are brought about by post-war Reconstruction. But the second Klan of the 1920s and like the Tulsa bombings and these other racial massacres that are taking place against Black communities, they all kind of have this similar strain of using violence to essentially make sure that Black Americans aren't economically independent. Because once they are independent, that means that they don't have to work on plantations for slave wages anymore, right? The US eventually withdraws troops from the southern United States. This occurs in 1877, little shy of 12 years after the Civil War ends. So the South isn't actually occupied for very long. The federal government doesn't really do a lot to make sure that the rights of newly freed Africans, former slaves, are protected. And a lot of this is contingent on cooperation between the North and the South to make sure that industrialization and capital development continues to go. The longer the North has forces stationed in the South, the slower industrial development is going to go on, and the longer it's going to take for northern and southern kind of hierarchies to cooperate with each other, right? If you are running a plantation and you are trying to exploit as much profit out of the labor of newly freed slaves as possible, having Union troops stationed around and making sure that you're not murdering people really kind of restricts your ability to use fear as a motivator for people to work for you for essentially nothing, right? Before it was practically nothing, now it's essentially nothing. So in order to kind of increase this industrial development, there's a contested election in 1876, and the North agrees that in exchange for placing a moderate Republican as president, they can withdraw forces from the South. This leaves newly freed African Americans kind of without any sort of system of self-defense or protection. And so through economic strangulation of Black businesses, racial terror invoked by the Klan, and also just very anti-democratic racialized policies that restrict political participation. Through all of this, instead of any sort of racial equality coming about in the South after the Civil War, we actually instead get a system known as sharecropping. And so when I talk about what is essentially slavery versus what is practically slavery, right? Sharecropping, in legal terms, still allowed African Americans to be free, but economically they were much more tied to landlords and former slave overseers than, you know, the so-called wage slaves in the industrial Northeast. So how does sharecropping work? There's actually a pretty convenient infographic here. I didn't make it. It was pulled out of a textbook. But because the U.S., the North kind of removes any sorts of land redistribution efforts that were being made by generals like Sherman, because freed African slaves don't have access to their own plots of land. Land is still, you know, essentially held almost entirely by Southern plantation owners. This means that in order to make a living, African Americans essentially have to work on plots of land that they rent from landowners. And not only are they renting this land, right, but they also have to rent all of the seed that they're using, all of the tools that they're using to grow crops in exchange for wages that can support their families. Now, newly freed slaves don't have all of this capital of their own to invest in, right? All of the labor that they've been performing for the past 300 years up until this point, 250 years up until this point, has been for the benefit of slave masters. And so they don't just have a savings account where they can say like, all right, well, I'm going to pay you this amount of money to rent this amount of land. They have to get that land on advance. And so sharecropping is where they are provided, they get land and they get seed and they get the tools they need to use. But in exchange, they have to promise the landowner a certain share of the crop, right? It can be half, it can be upward of half. So by the time the sharecropper plants and harvests this massive crop, because they've had to pay to rent land, they've had to pay in advance for seed, but also things like food, tools, clothing. By the time it gets to the point where you are you're harvesting the crop, either because it's the case in the market, but also potentially just because the landlord is lying in documents, right? Landlords would occasionally like just tell newly freed slaves, like even if they got 50% of the crop and it was worth this amount of money, they would just lie and say, actually, all of this crop that you gave me, I only got this much for, and so you still owe me X amount of money, even though the debt might have actually been paid off. So through a couple of different ways, landlords would basically inform sharecroppers that like, you now still owe a certain amount of money. I will, of course, advance you land and crops for the next year, but in exchange, you have to give me a greater share of the next crop. And so the cycle just keeps on repeating, and it goes on for many decades after the end of the Civil War, even up until the Great Migration, and even after that into the Civil Rights Movement. Sharecropping was a very lucrative system, much akin to slavery, where people were very much tied to the land they were working and the people they were working for. There was just the technical freedom to leave if you wanted to, though where are you going to go if you want to leave these communities you're kind of entrenched in? So let's talk about the legacy of the Civil War, right? In Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, he specifically refers to the Civil War as kind of the nation's largest labor strike. And whether or not you agree with him depends on a couple of factors, and actually kind of can inform how we look at labor and labor strikes today. So was the Civil War the nation's largest labor strike? Well, if you say yes, it's because probably you're looking at an industry-centric work stoppage made for political and economic gains. In the context of the Civil War, slaves who were self-emancipating were creating one of the largest labor stoppages in the agricultural industry. And they were doing so for their political gains, right, freedom, but also their economic gains, their ability to be self-reliant and economically independent. This ultimately isn't made possible. Reconstruction is, I guess, bungled is a good word, and the system of sharecropping is able to take its place instead of a system of full political participation. Is the Civil War the nation's largest labor strike? If you're saying no, there's a couple of reasons why historians would argue that. There's no cohesive organization that slaves kind of make in order to bargain terms of work with the government, be it in the Union or the Confederacy, right? There's no formal bargaining process. There's no, united agricultural workers of the Confederacy that goes to the bargaining table with slaveholders. So people who argue that the Civil War wasn't a strike will instead couch it in terms of this was a war, and this, in war, economic violence happens, and labor stoppages and walk-offs are part of economic violence. So it really depends on how you look at it. If the Civil War was fought to end slavery, then it might not have been a labor stoppage. If the Civil War eventually came to focus on slavery because of slaves refusing to work, then it was an incredibly effective strike, right? Now, if you're thinking this is kind of these are questions that aren't necessarily relevant or important, they do have meaning today, right? These aren't really questions about unionization and unions aren't really things that we've been able to approach in this class yet, and that's going to start changing after next week now that we've gotten up to 1877 and this end of Reconstruction. But even today, does a union need to exist in order for there to be a strike, or in order for a strike to be considered legal? Do you need to have a union in order to do that? What kind of institutions can serve as a organization representing striking workers, right? Does it have to be a union, or can a community church serve as one of these like bargaining representatives? Throughout the Civil War and Reconstruction, a lot of the earliest forms of Black political and economic activism were actually centered around the church. And some of the largest walk-offs and strikes and greatest strides made in the Civil War and in Reconstruction in terms of Black rights and in terms of ending slavery were very much centered around the Black church kind of enticing people to leave or walk away. So can a church serve as a union, or does a union need to be more legally defined? And the National Labor Relations Board, right, the NLRB, might give you a different answer than, say, a community-based union like the IWW or Fight for 15. Does a strike need to involve the owners of a productive process, or can workers bargain directly with the government? So in this case, the North, right? If slaves are walking off en masse from these agricultural sites of production, their slave masters aren't in that discussion, right? Whether or not they can join the union lines and participate in union efforts is kind of between them and the federal government. And also these policies that redistribute land, the 40 acres and a mule, were not decided by landowners. They were decided by the federal government. And while those two groups ultimately side with each other, how would things go differently, and how would we view labor stoppages and labor strikes if, you know, the federal government decided on, went with the side of land redistribution, like Sherman's plans, right? Can workers bargain directly with the government, or do they have to bargain with their supervisors, be they, you know, slave overseers or shop floor managers? A couple other comments about the legacy of the Civil War is how it's sometimes viewed. It's a very famous historian. His name is Charles A. Beard, and he argues that the U.S. Civil War, emancipation, and all of the other major changes that are brought on by a Union victory in the Civil War amount to a second American Revolution. And some other historians have sided with Beard on this, right? James McPherson and Gregory Downs are just two examples of other pretty notable historians who have characterized the Civil War this way, as the second American Revolution. Now, historians, unlike Beard, who are more akin to Du Bois, who we're going to be reading for Black Reconstruction, didn't really characterize the Civil War as a second American Revolution, so much as they characterize it as a war of class conflict. Specifically, Du Bois argues that the Civil War was less a war about American values, and like it was less a second American Revolution than it was industrial capitalism kind of reaching its hands across the remainder of the United States and entrenching itself as the new national system, right? We started off this lecture talking about how the system in the South, agricultural chattel slavery, was much more akin to a feudalist structure where you had the landed aristocracy controlling political power. With the advent of industrial capitalism, the end of slavery, and the rise of wage agricultural work, this is going to change, this political power is going to change hands, and it's going to shift gradually away from agricultural landowners and more into the hands of industrial capitalists and people who kind of own all of the means of production. And land is just one of these things now, right? Whoever controls the machinery to create textiles, whoever controls natural resources like coal, copper. So the amount of power that the landed gentry in the South is going to have is going to be lessened, and you're going to see a change in how work is made away from this feudalist structure and more towards industrial capitalism. So whether or not it's an American Revolution or kind of like this class conflict, or if they both coincide with one another, different historians will give you different answers there. All of this is to say, we should be walking away from this lecture with three main points, right? So let's recap. The first is that the Civil War was a conflict over slavery. If someone says it is over states' rights, you need only remind them that it is a states' right to what? Because it was always slavery. The slave states very much opposed states' rights when it came to a state's rights to nullify things like the Fugitive Slave Act or to assist in slaves freeing and seeking out freedom. When a state had the right to do that, the South very much opposed those rights. So ergo, it's entirely about slavery. Second, ending the labor system of chattel slavery was only made possible by self-emancipating slaves and the mass emigration of enslaved people by away from these sites of agricultural production and towards Union lines. These kinds of labor stoppages had such an impact on the Southern economy that the North was forced to extend emancipation to newly self-freeing Black slaves, kind of out of political necessity and for strategic value, whereas in the beginning of the war, they had no intention of doing so. And that third and lastly is that the inability of the United States to rectify the injustices of slavery contributed to a lasting socioeconomic and political inequalities that we're still experiencing today, right? Even though slavery ended ostensibly in 1865, there was still a system of widespread racialized economic exploitation that kept families down for many years after the end of the Civil War and presented very real barriers to them moving up in society the way that free labor advocates in the Republican Party would have wanted them to. And a lot of this is because Reconstruction was bungled, right? Newly freed slaves weren't given the opportunity to be economically self-reliant. and they were very much still tied to this landed property owning class in the South through the system of sharecropping. And so the amount of economic opportunity that freed slaves enjoyed for a very long time was very much limited. All right, so this concludes our lecture for today. For the next class discussion, read chapter 2 of Loomis's 10 Strikes. That's the Slave on Strikes chapter that will get a little bit more into what we've been discussing here. And also read chapters 4 and 5 of Black Reconstruction. That's W.E.B. Du Bois's work that I've been referencing. We're only going to read the 2 chapters out of there. It's a very large book. It's I would go so far as to say it's a third reading recommendation. If you would like to tackle the entire book, you definitely should. It's an amazing work of historical scholarship. But for our purposes, we're only going to read chapters 4 and 5. And again, that link is going to be on Canvas. So just go ahead and click there, or you can honestly find it pretty easily with a Google search as well. Again, if you have any questions prior to our next meeting, just go ahead and send me an email and be more than happy to clarify anything that was said in this lecture, or if you just have any sorts of general questions about the class at all. All right, see you later.